3 asteroids passed inside the orbit of the Moon in 5 days, each one larger than the last. The smallest was the size of a delivery van. The largest was the size of a 2-story house, carrying enough energy on impact to release 5.5 Hiroshimas of force over any city it happened to be aimed at. The news did not lead with any of them. The news did not connect them. The news did not tell you that a fourth object, larger than all 3 of those combined, is inbound for the 18th of May. In the next hour, I am going to walk you through what just passed Earth, what the news did not say about it, and the one number that should keep you awake at night. Stay with me to the end. The pattern is the warning. Tell me in the comments what you think. Is this a fluke, blind spot, or something arriving? Subscribe so you do not miss the 18th and what comes after. Now, let's get into it. Between the 7th of May and the 11th of May, something happened in our near-Earth neighborhood that almost no one outside of a handful of small astronomy newsletters and one viral image is talking about. 3 separate asteroids passed inside the Moon's orbit, closer to Earth than the Moon itself is at any point in its monthly cycle. None of them hit us. None of them came close enough to be a national security problem. But all 3 of them passed within a window of just 5 days, and each one was physically larger than the one before it. The first of them was a 6-meter object, designated 2026 J01. It crossed inside the lunar distance on the 7th of May, missing Earth by about 0.3 lunar distances, which works out to roughly 115,000 kilometers. 6 meters is, in human terms, the size of a delivery van. 2 days later, on the 9th of May, a 9-meter object designated 2026JO crossed inside the same boundary, also at roughly 0.3 lunar distances. 9 meters is the size of a city bus. 2 more days after that, on the 11th of May, a 12-meter object designated 2026JD1 passed at 0.8 lunar distances. 12 meters is about 40 feet. That is the size of a 2-story suburban house, and it is the largest of the 3. And it is the one that, if any one of these objects had not missed, would have made the 11th of May the kind of date that gets a wing of every history museum in the world. A delivery van, a city bus, a 2-story house, each one larger than the last. Each one passing inside the orbit of the Moon. Each one missing Earth by a distance that, on the scale of the solar system, is the cosmic equivalent of a near miss in a crosswalk. And the part that should make any honest person pause is this. Most of the people on Earth who got within a single window pane of this happening will never hear about it. The news did not lead with the first one. The news did not lead with the second one. By the third one, a viral image was circulating online. A close approach table with the sub-lunar entries highlighted in orange. And that was it. That was the public-facing coverage of 3 near misses in 5 days by objects that, in the right place at the right time, would have produced city-scale damage. You will, in the next hour, hear me describe these objects in considerable detail. You will hear what each one would have done if its orbit had been a fraction of 1 degree different. You will hear about the upcoming pass on the 18th of May by an object that may be larger than all 3 of these combined. You will hear about the spring of fireballs that preceded this cluster, and the still unidentified parent body that may be feeding both of them. You will hear about why we did not see any of these 3 objects in time to do anything about them, even hypothetically, and the documented policy choices that led to that situation. And you will hear my honest assessment of which of the available explanations actually fits the data, which I have to warn you in advance is not the most reassuring one. But before any of that, let me put one number on the table and let it sit there. 12 meters, 32,000 miles per hour, 87 kilotons of TNT energy, 1 every 17 years. Hold those numbers. They are the punchline of the entire story, and they are the punchline of every cluster like this for the foreseeable future. We will get to what they mean. Right now, Just sit with the picture. A delivery van, a city bus, a 2-story house, crossing inside the orbit of the moon, inside of 5 days, inside of 1 calendar month in the spring of 2026. That is what happened. That is real. The question is what it tells us about everything we have not yet seen. Let me focus on the third one. Of the 3 objects in the May cluster, 2026 JD1 is the one that does the most work, narratively, scientifically, and in terms of consequences, because it is the only one that crosses a particular size threshold that real damage starts to register at. 6 meters is the size where you get a bright fireball, a sonic boom, maybe some recoverable fragments on the ground, and a few people on the ground asking each other if they just saw a missile. 9 meters is bigger, but still in the same ballpark. 12 meters is where the simulation starts to use words like devastation. Researchers at Purdue University maintain a tool called Impact Earth, which lets you feed in the parameters of an incoming asteroid and watch what happens. Diameter, velocity, impact angle, target location, target material. The simulation runs the physics and produces an output that includes airburst altitude, energy yield, shockwave intensity, thermal radiation, and probable casualty estimates. It is not exact. It is a model, but it is calibrated against the real impacts we have data on, including Tunguska in 1908, Chelyabinsk in 2013, and several smaller events with recoverable fragments. And the numbers it produces are taken seriously by the small community of researchers whose entire job is to think about exactly this kind of thing. Plug in 12 meters. Plug in 32,000 miles per hour, which is about 14 kilometers per second, which is the approximate velocity JD1 was carrying when it passed us. Plug in a 45-degree impact angle, which is the most probable value across the population of incoming asteroids. Drop the target marker on, let us say, a major city. Manhattan. The simulation runs, and the numbers come back. The asteroid airbursts. It does not crater. It enters the atmosphere, ablates, and explodes approximately 11 miles above the ground. The energy of that explosion is approximately 87 kilotons of TNT equivalent. For comparison, the bomb dropped on Hiroshima was around 15 kilotons. So JD1 would have released roughly 5.5 Hiroshimas of energy, all at once, 11 miles up in the air. What does that produce on the ground? 11 miles is a long way up. The shockwave reaches the surface, but it has spread out considerably by the time it arrives. The Impact Earth simulation, run over Manhattan, returns essentially no fatalities from the direct shockwave at distance, no crater, no thermal damage of consequence at street level. What it does produce is a sonic event so intense that windows would break across multiple counties. The flash would be visible across the entire eastern seaboard. The boom would be heard from Boston to Philadelphia. People driving on the highway might lose control of their vehicles from the shock. Anyone with a clear view of the airburst would be temporarily blinded. The psychological effects of a city watching a bus-sized rock detonate in the air with the energy of 5 Hiroshimas would be a multi-generational trauma, even with relatively minimal physical damage. That is the smallest version of the cluster. That is the version where nothing really happens. That is what JD1, missing Earth, by approximately 307,000 kilometers actually means, on the ground, in human terms. If you had been a resident of any major coastal city on the morning of the 11th of May, and the orbital geometry had been 1 degree of inclination different, your morning would have started with the brightest flash any human had ever seen, followed by a sound that would never quite leave your memory. And here's the part of the number I want you to actually hold on to. Impact Earth, having computed all of that, then tells you how often this happens. The simulator reports that an impact of this size occurs on Earth approximately once every 17 years on average. Once every 17 years. That is the recurrence interval for the size class of object JD1 belongs to. 17 years. That means there is a JD1 class atmospheric event somewhere on Earth, over the ocean, over uninhabited terrain, over polar ice, or, statistically, sooner or later, over a populated area, approximately on the cadence of the Olympic Games. The Chelyabinsk event in 2013, which produced 1,500 injuries when its shockwave shattered windows across an industrial city, was an object approximately 20 meters in diameter. That is larger than JD1. But the next tier down events, in the 10 to 15 meter range, are happening roughly every 2 decades. They happen high in the atmosphere. They happen far from any human, and we do not hear about them because there is no one downrange. But there will be, eventually. The math does not stop running. Every 17 years, on average, the dice get rolled. Most of the time, they come up ocean. Sometimes they come up Siberian taiga. Eventually, they will come up a city. JD1 was the third of 3 rolls in 5 days. Each roll was bigger than the one before it. The dice came up empty all 3 times. And in the case of JD1 in particular, the empty came down to a margin of about 307,000 kilometers, which sounds like a long way until you realize it is a distance the object covered in less than 6 hours of travel. That is the size of the buffer. 6 hours. 6 hours of cosmic offset between a quiet news cycle and a national emergency. Now 12 meters is not a Tunguska-class event. Tunguska was bigger. The classic estimate for the Tunguska object is somewhere between 50 and 80 meters in diameter, with the most cited modern figure around 50 to 60. Run Tunguska on the Impact Earth simulator with the same 45-degree angle and a comparable velocity. Drop it on Manhattan. The output that comes back is in a different category entirely. The airburst is lower, around 2 miles up instead of 11. The energy is 5 megatons, not 87 kilotons. 5 megatons is about 150 Hiroshimas. The shockwave at the ground is 197 decibels, which is well past the threshold of lethal acoustic pressure, which is around 194 decibels. Peak wind speeds in the affected zone exceed 500 miles per hour, which is faster than any tornado ever recorded. The simulation estimates that, dropped on a city of New York's size, the wind blast alone would kill approximately 300,000 people. And Tunguska happens approximately once every 390 years. So put the 2 numbers next to each other. 87 kilotons every 17 years. 5 megatons every 390 years. The first one is a city-scale evacuation event with minimal direct fatalities. The second one is a population extinction event for the immediate metropolitan area. JD1 was the smaller one, the 17-year version. The version where most of the people in the affected city probably survive, with broken windows and burst eardrums and lifelong PTSD. The version where the economy of a major American or European or Asian city is wiped out for a decade. The version that, on the cosmic clock, is about as common as an Olympic Games. It missed us by 6 hours of distance. The reason I am putting these numbers on the table this early in the video, and the reason I want you to remember them, is that everything else in this story, the fireball spring, the rock comet hypothesis, the upcoming pass on the 18th, the funding gap, the question of whether the news is or is not telling us the truth, gets weighed against this one fact: 12 meters, 32,000 miles per hour, 87 kilotons, once every 17 years. 6 hours from being a story we are all still talking about 10 years from now. That is the baseline. That is what the cluster of the week of May 7th actually means, stripped of every framing and rhetorical device. And the cluster is not over. There is one fact about the May cluster that is more disturbing than the size escalation, and more disturbing than the proximity, and more disturbing than the Tunguska comparison. It is the fact of the discovery timeline. Let me give you the case of 2026 JM2, which is technically not one of the 3 primary cluster objects, but which is one of the contextual data points around them. JM2 was a small object, most likely under 2 meters in diameter, that passed Earth at 0.114 lunar distances on the 7th of May. That is about 43,800 kilometers from the center of Earth, or roughly 37,400 kilometers above the surface. To put that in perspective, geostationary satellites orbit at an altitude of approximately 36,000 kilometers. JM2 passed approximately 1,600 kilometers above geostationary orbit. That is closer to Earth than every weather satellite, every direct broadcast television satellite, every global navigation backbone satellite. It crossed inside the ring of human technology we have placed around our planet. It was first observed at the JPL SynTrack robotic telescope in Aubrey, California at 0702 Coordinated Universal Time on the 8th of May. The closest approach had occurred at 1306 UTC on the 7th of May. Do the math. Approximately 17 hours and 56 minutes after the object had already passed us. We did not see it coming. We saw it going. That is the difference between an alert and an obituary. This is not an anomaly. This is the modal case for small near-Earth objects in the size range we are talking about. The reason is purely a function of physics and detection capability. A 6-meter asteroid at a distance of 1.5 astronomical units, which is to say, slightly farther from Earth than Mars is from the Sun, reflects almost no sunlight in a direction that telescopes on Earth can detect. The amount of light reaching us is below the noise floor of every survey telescope we currently operate. The object is, for all practical purposes, invisible until it gets very close. How close is very close? Roughly within 1 lunar distance. Sometimes slightly more for slightly larger objects, or for objects passing at high relative velocity that produce a clear apparent motion against the background stars. But for the size class that includes JO1, JO, and JD1, objects in the 6 to 12 meter range, the detection window is essentially the same as the close approach window. You see them when they are right next to you. And by then, if they were going to hit you, they would already be hitting you. The major surveys we use to catch this kind of object are the Catalina Sky Survey at Mount Lemmon in Arizona, Pan-STARRS on Haleakala in Hawaii, and the Asteroid Terrestrial Impact Last Alert System, abbreviated ATLAS, which has telescopes in Hawaii, Chile, and South Africa, and which recently achieved full sky search capability per a NASA announcement earlier this month. Together with a handful of smaller national surveys, this is the entire detection apparatus. These surveys discover roughly 10 new near-Earth asteroids every day. The total catalog has grown to more than 41,000 confirmed near-Earth objects as of March 2026. That sounds like a lot, and in absolute numbers it is, but the catalog is heavily biased toward the large objects. For asteroids larger than 1 kilometer in diameter, the civilization-ending impactors, the catalog is estimated to be more than 95% complete. For asteroids in the 100 to 300 meter range, the size class that includes Tunguska, completeness drops to maybe 40 or 50%. For asteroids in the size class of JD1, JO, and JO1, objects under 30 meters, the catalog completeness is estimated at less than 1%. Less than 1%. There may be tens of millions of objects in this size class on Earth-crossing orbits, and we have cataloged fewer than 1 in 100 of them. The rest are an open question. When you look at the orange-shaded rows on the close approach table, the rows marking the sub-lunar passes, what you are actually looking at is the visible top of a much larger, mostly invisible population. The visible objects are the ones the survey telescopes happened to catch in the narrow window, when they were close enough to detect. The invisible ones are the rest of the population, moving in the same general region of space, passing inside the lunar distance on the same kind of timeline, and never being seen because no telescope was pointed in the right direction at the right time. The cluster of May 7th through May 11th might be, in one reading, a statistical fluke. In another reading, it might be the visible component of a population that has been crossing inside the lunar distance at roughly this rate all along, and we are only now catching enough of them to notice the pattern. The post-2016 upgrade to the Mount Lemmon camera, which expanded its field of view by a factor of approximately 4, has produced more than an order of magnitude increase in the number of small near-Earth objects discovered annually. In 2024 alone, the surveys collectively discovered more than 1,900 near-Earth asteroids, smaller than 50 meters, more than 60% of all near-Earth discoveries that year. Most of those were detected at or near closest approach. Many were detected after. This is the part of the story that the news does not generally foreground. The headline of any individual close approach event is the close approach. The actual story, the story that runs underneath all of these individual events, is that we are operating without a complete map. We are walking through a forest with most of the trees invisible. We can see the ones we have happened to bump into. We cannot see the ones we have not bumped into yet. And the rate at which we are encountering new trees has been climbing for 10 years, not because there are more trees, but because our eyes have been getting better. That should not be reassuring. That should be the opposite of reassuring. Because if the rate of detection is increasing, while the underlying population is constant, that means we have been living every previous year of every previous decade inside an environment we did not understand. The cluster is not new. The cluster is something that was always happening. We just did not have the equipment to see it. And the equipment we have now is still nowhere near complete. The proposed NEO Surveyor Space Telescope, designed specifically to close the small asteroid detection gap by operating in infrared from space rather than visible light from Earth, has experienced repeated funding-driven delays. The current planetary defense budget at NASA is under $200 million per year across every program combined. That is less than the cost of a single F-35 fighter jet. The annual cost of seeing the rocks before they hit us is roughly one airplane. We have, collectively, as a civilization, decided that one airplane is the right price for that information. The cluster of May 7th through May 11th is what the world looks like at that price. Now I want to step back from the May cluster for a moment and talk about what happened in March, because the two events are sitting next to each other in time, and they may or may not be sitting next to each other for a reason. In March of 2026, the American Meteor Society, which is the citizen science clearinghouse for fireball reports across the United States and increasingly around the world, recorded the single highest number of fireball events in any month in the Society's documented history. That is a database that goes back decades. March was the top month. April was the second highest. Not quite at March's level, but well above the long-run baseline. By the end of April, the rate started to taper. By early May, fireball reports had returned roughly to the historical normal background rate. The surge began, peaked, and resolved over approximately 6 to 8 weeks. The numbers, taken individually, are striking. There were more than 50 events with witness counts exceeding 100 reports each, against a multi-year average closer to 20. One event had 142 confirmed witnesses, which is well above the prior record of 49. Approximately 79% of large fireball events were accompanied by audible sonic booms, against a historical baseline closer to 40%, which is a separate signal entirely, because sonic booms imply low-altitude penetration by larger fragments, and a doubling of that frequency means the population of meteoroids producing the surge was systematically larger than the population producing normal background fireball flux. Recoverable fragments were confirmed from at least 3 independent locations during the surge window: Texas, Germany, and Ohio. In each case, the fragments were classified chemically as howardite eucrit diogenite achondrites, which is a type of meteorite consistent with material from the asteroid 4 Vesta, the second largest body in the main asteroid belt. Vesta is a known source of debris in the inner solar system, but a coincident set of recoveries across 3 continents in a single multi-week window is unusual and statistically interesting. There was another dimension to the surge that was unusual: the radiance of the fireball events. The directions in the sky the meteoroids appeared to be coming from were geographically anomalous. 12 events came from declinations above plus 70 degrees, meaning they were entering the atmosphere from directions very close to the celestial North Pole. The prior single-year record for high declination events was 5. The surge doubled it. That is a population-level deviation that almost certainly does not happen by chance. And the most important radiant signal of all was the Anthelion enhancement. The Anthelion zone is the patch of sky directly opposite the sun from Earth's position, meaning, in plain terms, the night side. Meteoroids coming from the Anthelion source are on orbits that bring them toward Earth from the direction of Earth's own night sky. In a typical year, Anthelion fireballs are a minority component of the total flux, with a baseline of 1 to 6 events of significant brightness in a calendar year. In the spring of 2026, there were 12 Anthelion events in 3 months, against a baseline of 1 to 6 in a full year. This is the kind of pattern that, if you are a working planetary scientist, makes you pull up the orbital geometry chart and start asking what kind of debris field could produce an Anthelion-biased fireball surge with high declination contamination and a chemical signature consistent with Vesta. The answer is not random sporadic background. The answer is some kind of organized debris stream. There was an attempt at an answer in a peer-reviewed paper published in the Astrophysical Journal in March of 2026. The paper was titled, in part, Asteroidal Activity Among Meteor Datasets, and the lead author was Patrick Schober, working with collaborators across several institutions. The paper examined a combined dataset of 235,271 individual meteor and fireball detections from 4 independent all-sky video networks: the Global Meteor Network, the Cameras for All-Sky Meteor Surveillance System, the European Video Meteor Observation Network Database, and the Japanese network Sonoda-co. 4 independent observation systems, 235,000 events, decades of data. What the Schober paper confirmed, and this is the part that matters for our story, is the existence of a new, previously uncatalogued meteor stream consisting of 282 member events on a coherent low perihelion orbit. The orbit was asteroidal, not cometary, meaning the parent body was a rocky asteroid rather than an icy comet. The perihelion, the closest approach to the Sun, was extremely low, roughly 5 times closer to the Sun than Earth's orbit. And the orbital geometry was consistent with what astronomers call a rock-comet stream, a stream of debris produced by an asteroid being thermally and mechanically disrupted by repeated close passes to the Sun. The classic example of a rock comet is the asteroid 3200 Phaethon, parent body of the Geminid meteor shower. Phaethon does not have the ice content of a true comet. It has the rocky composition of an asteroid, but it passes so close to the Sun on each orbit that solar heating drives off material, producing the debris stream Earth crosses every December as the Geminids. Rock comet behavior is rare but documented, and it is the only known mechanism that produces a coherent meteor stream from an entirely rocky parent body. The Schober paper confirmed that one such stream had been identified, with 282 coherent members, on an orbit that brings it close to, but not into Earth's path. The paper did not identify the parent body. The paper did not link the stream directly to the March 2026 fireball surge. But the geometry is consistent. The chemistry is consistent. The timing, the surge, peaked just as Earth would have been crossing the orbital plane of the stream, is consistent. The Anthelian biased radiants are consistent. The honest scientific summary of the spring 2026 fireball anomaly is this. It happened. It was real. It was statistically extreme along several independent axes. It is consistent with Earth passing through the debris field of a thermally disrupting parent body that has not yet been identified, and it tapered off in late April, which is exactly the timing one would expect if the densest part of the debris stream had moved out of Earth's path as the geometry shifted with the season. The fireballs stopped. The cluster started a week later. This is the part where I have to be careful, because the temptation is to draw a line from the first dot to the second dot and call the picture complete. The fireballs and the cluster might be unrelated. The fireballs are millimeter to meter scale meteoroids. The cluster objects are 6 to 12 meter asteroids. Those are different size populations, and a debris stream that is rich in the smaller class is not automatically also rich in the larger class. The two could be independent observations that happen to have occurred in adjacent calendar months in the same calendar year. But it would be strange. It would be a coincidence on top of a coincidence. Two statistical anomalies in the same hemisphere of the same year is the kind of pattern that, in any other domain, would prompt at least a working hypothesis. And the working hypothesis that fits both is the one I am about to lay out in the next section. Let me state the hypothesis cleanly, and then let me argue against it, and then let me argue for it. The hypothesis is, somewhere in the inner solar system, an asteroidal parent body has been thermally disrupting under repeated near-sun passes for an extended period of time. The disruption has produced a coherent stream of meteoroid-class debris, of which the Schober 282-member stream is one detectable component. The disruption has also produced larger fragments, chunks in the 6-meter and larger range, which are now beginning to drift onto Earth-crossing trajectories at a rate elevated above the long-run baseline. The spring of 2026 saw Earth crossing the dense small debris component of the stream, producing the fireball surge. The week of May 7th saw Earth crossing a peripheral region of the stream containing the larger components, producing the sub-lunar cluster. The same parent body is producing both phenomena. We have not identified the parent body yet because it is either small, dark, very close to the sun, where direct observation is difficult, or some combination of all three. That is the hypothesis. That is what the data is consistent with if you take a maximalist interpretation of the available signals. The argument against this hypothesis is real and worth taking seriously. The Schober paper did not propose and does not require a large fragment component to its stream. The stream's confirmed members are all meteoroid-class objects in the millimeter to meter range, stretching the same parent body to produce a sub-lunar cluster of 6 to 12 meter asteroids is an extrapolation the paper does not endorse and the data does not yet support. The May cluster objects, when their orbital elements are examined individually, do not appear to share inclinations or eccentricities with the Schober stream. Their orbits, on initial inspection, look like ordinary Apollo-class near-Earth orbits with no special relationship to each other, beyond the temporal coincidence of having passed Earth in the same week. The fireball surge tapered off in late April, weeks before the cluster appeared. If the two were caused by the same debris field, one would expect either temporal overlap or continuous activity, not a quiet gap. So there is reasonable scientific resistance to the unified rock comet hypothesis. It is not impossible, but it is also not the default reading of the data. Now the argument for it. The argument for it is not that the rock comet hypothesis is the only explanation. The argument is that it is the only explanation of the available options that explains all three of the unusual signals at once. The fireball surge, the cluster proximity, the size escalation within the cluster, with three objects each larger than the last, which is exactly the pattern one would expect from Earth sweeping through a debris field in which fragment density varies with fragment size. Small particles dense in the core of the stream, larger particles sparser and more peripheral. A purely statistical clustering under Poisson assumptions has no mechanism to produce a monotonic size escalation. The rock-comet hypothesis does. The other available explanations are simpler, but explain fewer of the signals at once. Observation bias enhancement, meaning we are catching more events because our telescopes are better, explains the fireball surge well enough and explains the cluster well enough, but it does not explain why both anomalies happened in the same calendar year against a baseline that has been roughly stable across the post-2016 detection era. Pure statistical noise explains the cluster as an unfortunate Poisson outcome and the fireball surge as a separate Poisson outcome, but it requires two improbable events to land in the same year, and it has no mechanism for the size escalation. The rock-comet hypothesis is the most ambitious of the three frameworks, and it is the one that, if it turns out to be correct, has the most consequential implications. Because if the cluster is the leading edge of a still arriving population, rather than a one-time fluke, then there are more objects on the way. Possibly larger ones. Possibly on Earth-intercepting trajectories, rather than near-miss trajectories. The size escalation we have observed across the week of May 7th is, under this framework, not a statistical accident. It is the signal of an asymmetric debris stream whose larger components are still inbound. I want to be very clear that I am not stating the rock-comet hypothesis as a fact. I am stating it as the framework that best fits the available data. And I am stating it because the alternative frameworks fit the data less well. The honest scientific posture is to hold the hypothesis as plausible but unconfirmed, while orbital association studies and additional observations come in. The dishonest posture in either direction would be to declare the hypothesis confirmed or to dismiss it on grounds of conventional skepticism alone. If the rock-comet hypothesis is correct, the May cluster is not over. The peripheral region of an asteroidal debris stream, sparsely populated by larger fragments on the outer edges of the dense core, would deliver Earth-crossing objects on a timeline that could extend across weeks or months as Earth's orbital position drifts through the stream's geometry. Which brings us to the next pass. I need to spend a few minutes addressing a viral framing that has been attaching itself to the May cluster, because if I do not address it, you will see it on social media, and you will wonder if I missed something. I did not miss it. I considered it, and it is wrong, and I want to explain why in enough detail that you can recognize the same wrongness in similar framings the next time they show up. The viral framing claims that the May cluster is the result of a, quote, shared jet stream, which on cosmic scales allows for elastic-free collisions and condensation. The framing concludes that the situation is, quote, quite normal, because the objects would, quote, burn up in our atmosphere. The phrasing sounds technical. It uses terms that come from real physics. And that is precisely why it is dangerous. Because real physics is being lifted from a context where it correctly describes one thing and applied to a context where it incorrectly describes a different thing. The phrase jet stream in solar system astrophysics traces back to a paper by Hannes Alfvén, the Swedish plasma physicist, published in 1968 in the journal Astrophysics and Space Science. The paper was titled, simply, Jet Streams in Space. Alfvén proposed that Keplerian orbital motion of large numbers of small grains, when combined with inelastic collisions that lose energy on impact rather than perfectly reflecting like billiard balls, would naturally tend to drive the grain's orbits toward shared, narrow, ring-like trajectories. The math of the model is sound. The model has been refined and extended over the subsequent decades. A modern reformulation of the same physics goes by the name of streaming instability, in which dust grains in a gaseous protoplanetary disk experience aerodynamic feedback runaway, clump together under the combined influence of drag and gravity, and condense into planetesimal-sized bodies. Kilometer-scale rocks that are the building blocks of planets. This is all real physics. It is taught in graduate-level astrophysics programs. It is the leading framework for how planets form out of the dust and gas surrounding young stars. Alfvén's jet stream and the modern streaming instability are different formulations of the same underlying insight. That under the right conditions, inelastic interactions between many small bodies tend to drive the body's orbits into shared, organized, condensed structures. Here's the problem. This physics applies to protoplanetary disks. Disks of gas and dust surrounding young stars. It applies to the early stages of solar system formation. It applies, specifically and exclusively, to environments that have a large mass of gas mediating interactions between the small bodies and providing the aerodynamic feedback that drives the streaming instability. Take away the gas, and the streaming instability stops working. Wait long enough for the gas to dissipate, which happens within a few million years after the formation of a star, and the jet stream and condensation physics stops operating. Our solar system's protoplanetary disk dissipated approximately 4.5 billion years ago. There is no gas. There is no streaming instability. There is no Alfvén jet stream driving asteroids onto shared trajectories. The physics that the viral framing is citing, while real, applies to a phase of the solar system's history that ended 4,500 million years ago. The application of that physics to present-day near-Earth asteroid clustering is, at best, a category error. At worst, it is a deliberate attempt to make a wishful conclusion sound technical by smuggling in vocabulary from a different and unrelated branch of physics. The May cluster asteroids are not on shared trajectories. Their orbits, individually examined, have different inclinations, different eccentricities, different semi-major axes. They are not a stream. They are three objects whose individual orbits happen to bring them inside one lunar distance during overlapping days. The closest scientific framework that does apply, the rock-comet debris stream hypothesis I described in the previous section, is genuinely about correlated trajectories, but it is the result of a recent disruption event, not a primordial formation mechanism, and it does not invoke Alfvén jet streams or streaming instabilities at all. The second half of the viral framing, that the objects would burn up in the atmosphere, and so the situation is quote-unquote normal, is half correct in a way that matters. JO1 and JO, at 6 and 9 meters respectively, would almost certainly produce high-altitude airbursts with mostly local damage. That is true. But JD1, at 12 meters, would airburst much lower in the atmosphere, and would, as I described in Part 2, release roughly 5.5 Hiroshimas of energy approximately 11 miles above the surface. The 17-year recurrence interval for that size class is not by any reasonable definition quote-unquote normal. It is the cadence of major sporting events, and the upcoming JH2 pass on May 18th involves an object that may be substantially larger than JD1, potentially in the size class that approaches Tunguska. There is nothing reassuring about the size escalation, and the casual dismissal embedded in the viral framing is a piece of social media reassurance that the actual data does not support. I am taking the time to debunk this framing because it is the kind of half-technical, half-wishful misinformation that fills the gap when serious coverage is absent. When the news does not explain the actual science, the social media simulacrum of science fills the vacuum. And the vacuum, in this case, is large. Now back to the actual story. I want to spend a few minutes on what one lunar distance actually means, because the framing of the May cluster hinges on that threshold, and the threshold deserves to be understood rather than just invoked. One lunar distance, abbreviated LD, is approximately 384,400 kilometers. It is the average distance from the center of Earth to the center of the Moon. When a near-Earth object passes inside 1 LD, its trajectory was, at closest approach, closer to Earth than the moon ever gets. That is the threshold, and it has physical meaning. It is the boundary of the Earth-Moon gravitational system. Anything inside that boundary is in the immediate gravitational environment of our planet, and its orbit has been measurably bent by the encounter. An asteroid passing at 0.3 lunar distances is, in absolute terms, about 115,000 kilometers from Earth's center. That is about 18 Earth radii. It is not close to impact, but it is, in the cosmic context, an arm's length. The May cluster, with objects passing at 0.3, 0.3, and 0.8 LD, includes objects that cross deeply into Earth's gravitational sphere. The geostationary belt sits at approximately 0.1 LD. Some of the cluster objects passed Earth at distances that are, on a solar system map, indistinguishable from being inside our infrastructure. This matters because the question of, could it have hit us, is sometimes answered by people pointing out that the absolute distance was hundreds of thousands of kilometers. That is true, but it misses the point. For sub-lunar passes by Apollo-class objects, small perturbations in solar radiation pressure, in gravitational influences from other planets over preceding decades, in the cumulative Yarkovsky thermal recoil effect, produce trajectory variations of comparable scale to the missed distance itself. An asteroid passing at 0.3 LD, this orbit was, in a sense, just as likely to have passed at 0.0 LD, meaning intersecting Earth, given slightly different upstream conditions. The cluster of May 7th through May 11th did not hit us. That is true. The cluster of May 7th through May 11th could have hit us. That is also true. The framing that emphasizes one without the other is incomplete framing. The framing the news has, by and large, defaulted to, here's another harmless close approach, don't worry about it, it missed us by a lot, is structurally underplaying both the absolute proximity and the size escalation that runs through the week. Each individual flyby gets the harmless close approach treatment. The pattern across the three of them never gets the meta treatment. That is, in part, why the viral image is going viral. People with no astronomical background can see, in the form of a simple table with orange-shaded rows, that something is happening that does not match the reassurance they have been receiving piecemeal across the week. The table is doing the analytical job the news desks have not done. She knelt. The cluster is not over. The largest object of the entire window is still inbound. 2026 JH2 was discovered by the Mount Lemmon survey on the 10th of May. It was announced publicly 2 days later, on the 12th. The object's orbit was characterized rapidly enough that the Minor Planet Center confirmed it as a near-Earth asteroid in the same brief window. Its diameter is currently estimated to be in the range of 16 to 35 meters, with the most cited estimate around 25 meters. 25 meters is roughly the size of an 8-story building. It is significantly larger than JD1. It is approaching the lower edge of the size class associated with Chelyabinsk in 2013, which was approximately 20 meters, and which produced a 1,500 injury shockwave when its airburst broke windows across the city of Chelyabinsk in Russia. JH2 will pass Earth on the 18th of May, 2026, at 0.237 lunar distances. That is approximately 91,000 kilometers from Earth's center. It is closer than every confirmed pass in the May cluster except for JM2 on the 7th. It will brighten to approximately magnitude 11.5 at closest approach, which is bright enough to be visible through a small amateur telescope. The Virtual Telescope Project, which is the most established astrophotography live streaming operation in the world, has announced that it will broadcast the encounter live online for anyone who wants to watch. Let me pause on that and let it land. The largest object of the cluster, on a trajectory that brings it within a quarter of the lunar distance of Earth, was discovered by a single ground-based survey telescope 8 days before its closest approach. If the orbit had been slightly different, if JH2 had been heading toward Earth instead of past it, 8 days would have been the entire warning window. 8 days. For an object the size of an 8-story building, carrying enough kinetic energy on impact to airburst with a yield in the megaton range. There is no operational planetary defense system in the world capable of intercepting a 25-meter object on an 8-day notice. The DART mission, which demonstrated kinetic impactor asteroid deflection in 2022, required years of advanced planning and a target asteroid in the multi-hundred-meter size class on a multi-year approach window. 8 days is the gap between detection and arrival. There is no available technology that closes that gap with any meaningful action. JH2 is not on an Earth intercepting trajectory. The orbital solution is solid enough, 8 days out, that the no-impact prediction can be trusted. But the precedent is real. We have, in the space of 3 weeks, watched 4 sub-lunar passes by Apollo-class objects, ranging from 6 meters to 25 meters in diameter, and the warning window for the largest one was 8 days. That is the operational reality of present-day planetary defense. The fact that JH2 will pass safely is good news. The fact that JH2 was discovered with 8 days of warning is the news the headlines should be leading with. Because the implication, written out plainly, is that an object of the same size on a different trajectory would have given humanity 8 days to do absolutely nothing in particular before it arrived. That is the gap. That is what less than $200 million a year of planetary defense funding buys. The cluster, taken as a whole, includes JM2 on the 7th at 0.114, LD, JO1 on the 7th at 0.3 LD, JO on the 9th at 0.3 LD, JU1 and JX1 on the 9th at 0.7 LD each, JD1 on the 11th at 0.8 LD, JF2 on the 11th at 0.8 LD, and JH2 on the 18th at 0.24 LD, with several additional 1 to 3 lunar distance passes, filling out the table in between. That is, by any reasonable accounting, an enormously active 11 days. The orange-shaded rows on the table are the visible component of a far larger population we still do not have eyes on. And the upcoming pass on the 18th, with its 8-day discovery to arrival window, is the part of the story I want viewers of this video to internalize before any of the rest fades. 8 days, 25 meters, 0.24 LD. Watch the live stream. The Virtual Telescope project is doing the work the news desks have not done. And while you watch it, think about what those numbers would mean if they had been arranged into a different orbital solution. We have, at this point, walked through the entire arc of the story. 3 sub-lunar passes by progressively larger objects in 5 days, with a 4th and larger one still inbound. A spring of unprecedented fireball activity preceding them, with chemical signatures and orbital geometries pointing toward an unidentified parent body in the inner solar system. A peer-reviewed paper documenting a previously uncatalogued rock-comet stream that may or may not be connected. A debunking of the viral framing that tried to wave it all away as the harmless product of a primordial physics process that ended 4.5 billion years ago. A detection apparatus operating on a budget smaller than a single fighter jet. A discovery window for the largest object measured in days, not months or years. The mystery is not the asteroids. The mystery is what the asteroids are showing us about the model of the near-Earth environment we have been working from. If the cluster is a statistical fluke, and the fireball anomaly is a statistical fluke, and the temporal coincidence is also a statistical fluke, then the model is approximately correct, and we are simply observing the long tail of expected variation. If the cluster is the visible component of a long-standing population that we are only now beginning to detect thanks to improved survey capability, then the model has been wrong for decades, and the actual near-Earth environment is substantially more crowded than the popular understanding has registered. If the cluster is the leading edge of a rock comet debris stream produced by an actively disrupting parent body, then the model is missing a current, dynamic, time-evolving process that is putting larger objects on Earth-crossing trajectories at an elevated rate, and the next several months may produce additional clusters, possibly with larger components. I do not know which framework is correct. Honest scientific work in real time rarely produces clean answers. What I can tell you is that the second and third frameworks are both more likely than the first, and that the policy implications of any of the three are uncomfortable. If framework 2 is correct, if we are simply finally seeing what was always there, then the planetary defense funding gap is no longer a future policy question, but a current operational liability. The catalog completeness for the size class that includes the May cluster is under 1%. We have cataloged fewer than 1 in 100 of the objects that could produce a Hiroshima-scale airburst over a populated city. The May cluster is what discretionary planetary defense funding looks like in practice. If Framework 3 is correct, if there is an active debris stream feeding the inner solar system right now, then the cluster is not over, and the next several months should be monitored with substantially more attention than the news cycle has so far brought to bear. The next confirmed close approach will be the next confirmed close approach, and the public will hear about it the same way the public heard about JD1 and JH2. When the table updates, and if Framework 1 is correct, if everything I have described is a statistical accident, then the lesson is no less serious, because the cluster shows us, in vivid and unambiguous form, what a normal year of close approaches actually looks like when our detection capability is finally good enough to catch it. The cluster is the new baseline. The orange-shaded rows on the close approach table are not going away. The discovery rate is not slowing. The catalog of small, fast, hard to detect, potentially air-bursting objects is going to keep filling in, day after day, year after year. And each new entry is going to be, in the precise and operational sense, an event we did not see in time to do anything about if it had been heading at us instead of past us. There is a phrase that has been attached to events of this kind in some commentary, and I want to take it on rather than dismiss it. The phrase is simply, "It's a warning." The framing implies that the cluster is sending a message, that we should be paying attention, that the rate of events represents a kind of signal from a near-Earth environment that has been operating beneath our awareness for decades. I want to push back on the supernatural reading of that framing, because there is no agent in the asteroid belt sending us messages. Asteroids are inert rocks on Keplerian orbits, and they do not warn anyone of anything in any intentional sense. But I want to embrace the practical reading of the same framing, because the practical reading is correct. The cluster is a warning in the same way that a fire alarm in an empty hallway is a warning. It is a piece of information about a system state that, in the absence of the alarm, would have been invisible. The alarm is not the fire. The alarm is the proof that the fire detection system is working. And the question the alarm raises is whether the response capability is also working. Whether the firefighters are on staff, whether the trucks are fueled, whether the water mains are pressurized, whether the building's occupants have any way of getting out. In the case of the May cluster, the fire detection system worked. The survey telescopes found the objects. The data was published. The virtual telescope project will live stream the upcoming pass. The detection layer functioned on a shoestring budget exactly as designed. The response capability is the layer that does not exist. There is no operational planetary defense system in the world. There is the DART proof of concept. There is the proposed NEO Surveyor Space Telescope, perpetually underfunded. There is a small community of researchers doing exceptional work on a budget smaller than a single airplane. That is it. That is the entire stack between the average person and an object the size of a two-story house at 32,000 miles per hour. The May cluster missed. The May cluster, if framework 2 or 3 is correct, is the first in a sequence whose later entries we may also miss, or may not. The May cluster, if framework 1 is correct, is the new normal we are about to live inside for the rest of this century, as detection capability continues to improve and the orange-shaded rows continue to fill in. I do not know what the next several weeks will bring. No one does. The data will arrive when the data arrives, and the orbital association studies will report when the orbital association studies report, and we will know in retrospect which of the 3 frameworks fit the underlying physical reality. What I do know, and what I want to leave you with, is that the cluster has already told us something true, regardless of which framework wins. The near-Earth environment is far more dynamic than the popular understanding has tracked. The detection capability has improved faster than the public framing has caught up. The response capability has barely improved at all. And the gap between what we now know is happening and what we have prepared for is the gap that the cluster has just opened. Watch the 18th. Watch the virtual telescope live stream. Pay attention to which way the close approach table updates in the weeks that follow. And when the next news cycle moves on to something else, remember that the close approach table does not stop updating just because the cameras have stopped pointing at it. The cluster will be measured, in the end, not by the headlines it generated, but by the entries that fill in beneath it in the months ahead. 3 asteroids, 5 days, each one larger than the last, 1 inbound, 8 days of warning, less than $200 million of planetary defense per year, and a sky we still do not have a map of. That is what happened. That is what we know. And the rest of what we will know is still on the way.